All right. Hello, cool cats and kittens. Thought I would break down the women's authority or women's power DBQ for you guys now that we've all written it, or most of us have written it. Again, I have a plan chart out, a plan sheet out that I would have out during the actual test to help organize my thoughts. The DBQ prompt this time was asking you to evaluate the extent to which women exercised power and influence in various societies in Afro-Eurasia. So you've got, again, just 5 documents, and these documents are from different civilizations in different regions of the world. So when we're going through the documents, what we're going to be looking for is how did women exercise their power and influence? And that's what you need to be thinking about as you're getting the gist of these documents is, how am I going to group these? How am I going to organize these documents in response to the prompt? So let's go through some of these documents together. So again, if you don't have the documents open on your computer or on a phone or an iPad, I think it'd be helpful to see the document and then pause the video to get the references, because I don't have both the document and this plan sheet up at the same time. So if you take a look at document 1, this is the document from it's not from his daughter-in-law, it's about Genghis Khan's daughter-in-law. And it is created by a source by the name of Ala ad-Din Juvani. And he's written about Sorkontani Beki, who is the daughter-in-law of Genghis Khan in the 1200s, in his book called The History of the World Conqueror. History of the World Conqueror. So it's important to know, first of all, if you look at the source line, okay, this is going to be about a woman. He's writing about the daughter-in-law of Genghis Khan. That's all we know so far. We're not given a lot of information on the source line about the actual author, but let's go through the document and see how could we use this document in terms of how women exercise power and influence. We always need to be coming back to the prompt. So in document 1, the source is talking about how, basically Becky is in charge of the state. She's running the affairs of the state. She's got the Mongolian people under her command. She's in control. She's basically the Khan. And we know a little bit about her religion. She's Christian. But even though she is Christian, she does provide money and silver to the sheikhs and Muslims to build a madrasa, which is an Islamic school. So how could we use this document? Well, first thing that jumps out to me is she's clearly using her political power, political authority, right? So I'm going to jot that down. So political authority or power, something like that, somehow. So she is basically in control, or she's ruling, right? She's descended from Genghis Khan. She's in Genghis Khan's family, and after he's gone, she's in power for a little bit. I might also jot down that she is a Christian. I don't know how that might play out. Maybe I can use that. She's religious, but even though she's religious, she's Christian, she's also very tolerant, and not only tolerant, but she is supporting Muslims by helping them build schools. So religiously tolerant. I'm just going to jot that down because that might come into play later. Maybe she exercised her influence that way. Who knows? But definitely she's a ruler, right? In terms of soaping this document, again, as I said, we're not given a lot of information on the source line about the author, which is not what you're probably going to see on the actual AP exam. You're probably going to see a lot of information about the author. This practice one doesn't give you a lot, but you can infer that he is a Muslim with the name of Ala ad-Din Juvani. Just from that sound of the name, Ala ad-Din, you could probably infer that he is a Muslim in it, and he's a historian. So as a Muslim historian, he would probably, portray, I would probably use source here, and I would say something to the effect of, he's portraying the ruler in a favorable light, in a favorable way. He's calling her, what does he call her? He says that she has great generosity, right? And again, you're probably not going to be writing all of this down when you're actually taking the AP exam, but I'm just walking you through my thought process here. So he's portraying the ruler, who is a woman, Becky, in a favorable, generous way, due to the fact, why is he portraying her in such a favorable light? Due to the fact that she bestows silver for construction of a madrasa, which is an Islamic school. So, if I'm a Muslim and there's this Christian ruler who is supporting my religion and my faith, I might portray them in a favorable way. It's not surprising he would do that, given the fact that she's a benefactor of his religion. So that's kind of how I would portray or attempt or organize document 1. Okay, so if you take a look at document 2 now, and again, we have a document from our old friend Ibn Battuta. So College Board likes Ibn Battuta. You may see a document from Ibn Battuta. We'll see. So Ibn Battuta is talking about, in his Rihla, My Travels, he's talking about his experience when he goes to Mali in West Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa. He himself is from Morocco, which is North Africa, so he's traveled across the Sahara, and he's writing about what he sees there in the 14th century. And it's kind of interesting how he describes the women there. He's very, very shocked by the practices and how immodest the women are, and how the women do things without the permission of their husbands. He says they're bizarre. They can travel wherever they want. They can have friends outside of their marriage. They don't have to be with their husbands all the time. And the thing that kind of stuck out to me about this document and is interesting about how inheritance was determined in sub-Saharan African civilizations, and many of them, is that instead of a patrilineal passage of inheritance from father to son, in Mali, the inheritance is determined matrilineally. That is, the man passes his title and property to the male children of his sister and not to his own sons. So as you can see right away, women in Mali have a significant amount of value. They have a lot of economic influence in Malian society. So again, what am I going to write down? What's the gist here? I'm going to say, well, they're not really in charge. They're not governing. They don't have a lot of political authority. But what kind of influence do they have here? Well, through inheritance. And so inheritance of property and that kind of thing is generally an economic theme. So maybe economic influence in society might be a way that they exercise their power or influence. Because if you were, a woman in that civilization, you had a lot of influence because you got to determine who perhaps the next prince or the next ruler would be. In terms of how I would soap this document, the thing that you probably were wondering while you were reading this is, well, why is Ibn Battuta so shocked about these women? And one problem I kept seeing on many of your essay outlines, well, you say, well, he is a Muslim, and so he is shocked by this behavior. Well, aren't the women Muslim too? So you have to do a little bit more than say he's Muslim, because so were the people in Mali. They had converted to Islam long before he had arrived. So I would say something to the fact of, obviously use speaker here because, not everybody would have been shocked. Not everybody would have been shocked in Africa, but Ibn Battuta is not really from West Africa. He's from North Africa. And so, that's a little bit more of a conservative region, where they have more traditional roles for women and expectations, gender expectations. So I might approach this from the perspective of he's in more conservative, traditional roles in Morocco or North Africa, where women were veiled. Okay, and these women in Mali aren't walking around veiled. And also women in North Africa did not enjoy as much freedom, social freedom, as African women. And really, you can tie that back to their economic importance, which is really what this document is all about. Because if you have more economic importance, maybe that goes hand in hand with having a little bit more social freedom as well. So it's interesting. And then if you read the Rila in My Travels, Ibn Battuta goes on from West Africa. He goes to the Middle East. He goes to India. He goes to, Central Asia, China, Indonesia. Indonesia, the Muslim women, they're walking around without any tops on. So you can imagine just how shocked he is there. But again, you could also use Dar al-Islam perhaps as the occasion or historical context here of traders and merchants and connections across vast regions. Okay, and so let's move on to document 3. Document 3 is Empress Zhu, and she is the third wife of the Ming Emperor Yongle. I don't know if you guys remember, Emperor Yongle is the guy that sponsored the voyages of Zheng He and the great Chinese junk fleets, the treasure fleets that would go and collect tribute and show the might and majesty of the Chinese. So here is Emperor Yongle's third wife, and she is the actual source. She's the author of this document, and she's giving the name of the document is Excerpt from Instructions for the Inner Quarters. So if you actually go through this document, you'll see that she is advocating for submissiveness, that women should be subservient, they should do these things for the good of the family, that she should be beholden to the husband, etc., etc. But clearly, she is a ruler. She is an empress, right? She's not an emperor, but she's an empress. So there's kind of this dichotomy here, this two-sided coin here, where she has all the power. She's in charge of China, but she's also advocating that women be subservient. So it's a really fascinating document here, right? So if she's an empress, let's go back to our prompt here. How is she exercising power and influence? Again, she's exercising her power and influence through political authority. She is a governess. She is the ruler of China at this time. And she's inherited her power and her rule from her husband, but she is still exercising power and influence in terms of administrating, but not only administrating, being a ruler, being kind of a moral leader or an advisor or a moral philosopher about the best way for women to rule themselves. So maybe we could jot that down. So think about she's exercising influence from a moral lens as an advocate for social norms or something like that. Okay. Now that kind of leads us to the soap. What is it that you could use here to analyze? A lot of you got this one that attempted this one. This one was a pretty easy one to do. So clearly issues from China. What would be something from Acorn Peg that you could use here to explain why she's, basically saying women should know their place. Why is she doing this? Well, clearly she is probably a Confucian, right? And, Confucian was not a women's rights guy. He was somebody that was, everybody had their place and women should know their place and, have harmony in the home that will spill out into society as a whole. But I would probably use not just the fact that she is Confucian for speaker, I would probably use occasion. Because if you look at when this document is written, it's written in the early 1400s. Looks like my pen's about to run out of ink. So what has happened in China at the turn of the 14th century? Who has just been kicked out of China and defeated and removed from power? Well, it was the Yuan. The Mongols had just been defeated by the Chinese. And so there was this effort. I'm going to switch pens here. That's why it's always a good idea to have a backup pen, but you guys don't have to worry about that since you're typing. This is happening during a time period where the Ming are trying to reestablish China and the Confucian values of old China. And so this is a really good context or occasion. So this is a time period when China's going through this rejection of foreign influence and reestablishing Confucianism. And so it's not surprising that she would advocate for, traditional subservient, subordinate roles for women, the subordination of the wife to the husband, even though she herself is a ruler. The other thing, you might use purpose here. How could she bring back peace and tranquility to Chinese society by reinforcing traditional roles, traditional societal roles, so that there wouldn't be a lot of disruption and a lot of, people having different views and causing consternation. Okay. All right. So a couple documents left here. Document 4 is the shortest document in the DBQ. It's literally one sentence. And it is created by a Chinese diplomat who is visiting Cambodia. He's visiting Southeast Asia, and he's actually visiting the complex, the Temple of Angkor Wat, which I don't know if y'all remember watching the video about, but a very cool place. And so it says this is an excerpt from his Customs of Cambodia and his account of his travels there and during the Khmer Empire. And so he's basically saying that, or discussing how women are important in trade, how they are very significant in trade. And if you're a Chinese visitor, if you're a fellow merchant, the first thing you need to do when you get to Cambodia is you need to find a woman and basically use her to be your guide in terms of trade, and use her abilities to profit in commerce and exchange, right? So what is it that we could use now, again, to show, it's not talking about how women were rulers in Cambodia, but it's saying that, the first thing that you need to do when you get to Cambodia is to take in a woman to profit from her trading abilities. So how did women exercise power and influence here? It's clearly not political, but I would say, yes, again, economic influence. Okay, so it's very short, it's very sweet, it's right to the point. There's no wondering, gee, how could I use this document here? Because they were important traders and important people that would help you with commerce there. And so if you go over here to SOAP, how could you SOAP this document? I would probably use audience or purpose here, because it does say, the writer is giving advice, to fellow Chinese merchants. So something about advice to Chinese traders, with the end of to enrich China, for China to gain advantage in trade there, something along those lines. But you could also use occasion, because if you remember from our study of history back in when we were looking at Unit 2, what is it we remember about Southeast Asia, Southeast Asian women? Well, they were a little bit more independent. There was less patriarchy in Vietnam and Cambodia and those regions. I don't know if you guys remember the Trung sisters, who led those rebellions against Chinese incursions into Vietnam. So the Trung sisters were kind of like the Joan of Arc of Vietnam, right? And so Southeast Asia, more independent, less subservient during this time period. So that might explain why the women did have such an important role outside of the home. Okay, and lastly, if you look at document 5, this is an excerpt from the Chronicles of Minhaji Siraj Juzjani on the reign of Sultan Razia bint Iltutmish. So it's two names that are difficult to pronounce, but one of them is a chronicler talking about a sultan who just happens to be the first woman to ascend to the throne and lead an army of the Delhi Sultanate in northern India. So it's very, very interesting. Now, a lot of you, in terms of your SOAP on this document, made an error in that you were saying, well, as a fellow woman, Minahaji Siraj Juzjani would, of course, glorify a fellow woman ruler, et cetera, et cetera. But just so happens that this source is not a woman. This is a man describing a woman. So if you don't know the gender of the source and you're just guessing, don't put yourself in that position of being historically inaccurate. If you don't know for sure if it's a male or a female, just avoid that gender analysis, okay? But going back to how you could use the document here. So, obviously, clearly, this is a ruler, another female ruler. She's described as being a great sovereign who's wise, just, patron of the learned, dispenser of justice. She has great warlike skills. So again, how are we going to use this document? How did women exercise their power and influence? Through direct rule, political power, and administration, not just being a warrior or a general, but also making sure that justice is carried out, and being a patron of arts or of learning, scholarship, dispenser of justice. You've got this idea of a functioning, well-functioning government, but also she's a strong military ruler as well. So she's not afraid to lead men into battle. So that might be a way that she exercises power and influence. In terms of SOAP, again, we're not given a lot of information about the source. The name is confusing, and there's not a lot. They don't even identify the gender. They don't identify, how this person is connected to these events. It just says that Minahaji Siraj Juzjani is a chronicler, and that's about it. Now, again, the College Board is not going to give you a document like this. This is not going to be something that you would see. You would see, this chronicler served in the court of, the Sultan Iltutmish. So you could connect that person's, job or occupation to, putting their ruler in a favorable light. Or this person would have been a diplomat, or this person was somebody that was conquered by this ruler, et cetera, et cetera. You'd see something more than document 5 is giving you. So I would avoid this document. Remember, you only have to SOAP 2 documents to get both points. They'll give you 1 point for each correct SOAP that you make. So, try to maybe do 2 or 3. But if there's one like this that you just like, I don't really know how to approach this. I don't know how I would do occasion, because the Delhi Sultanate, this is a very conservative area. Yes, the women did have a lot of political power behind the scenes, but it was very rare for women to ascend to the throne and lead the Delhi Sultanate. So it's just, and there's not really an audience here that he's speaking to, other than he's a chronicler, he's a historian. This is very difficult to use audience to show how it affects why he's giving her so much praise and putting her in such a good light. So I would just kind of avoid this one. But again, pick the documents that are easy to SOAP on the DBQ on May 21st. Okay, so now that we kind of have the gist of these documents, and again, you're not going to spend this much time organizing the documents as I did, but once you get the gist of each document, now you're ready to think about, well, how am I going to group these into a couple of different paragraphs to answer this prompt? I think this week's was a little bit easier than last week's, in that the political kind of jumps off the page at you, political authority or political rule for documents 1, 3, and 5. And I think that document 4 was very, very easy to ascertain that women had their power and influence through economic or commercial ways. So I think document 4 would be separate from these political ones. Document 2 is a little bit more difficult, because if you didn't really think about inheritance, And then you were kind of thrown off a little bit about, well, how did women have influence there? They were just shocking to Ibn Battuta. But if you look at how they played a role, they had a significant amount of power in terms of who, passing on property, passing on inheritance to their sons. And they clearly in society had more freedoms because they had more economic power. I think that kind of goes along with document 4, and that they exercise their power and influence economically as well. So if you flip over to the back, or you start working on a different piece of paper, you can kind of start to sketch out what your topic sentences are going to be. So topic sentence 1, I'm probably going to do something to the effect of, women were capable and respected political leaders. All right, so that would be documents 1, as I said, 1, 3, and 5. And then the other topic sentence, they played important economic roles as well, even if they weren't important political or military leaders. And so the documents there to support are 2 and 4. Okay, outside evidence, there's a lot you could have used for outside evidence. We talked about the Yuan dynasty, which is not mentioned, I don't believe. You could have talked about Ibn Battuta, a little bit more about his travels to maybe Indonesia, where he also experienced shock and awe and revulsion about these immodest women. You could have talked about pastoralism and how Central Asian women typically had more, in pastoral societies, women had more freedom and power. Okay. Again, in terms of outside evidence, when you're including that in your essay, you want to make sure that you have proper nouns and that you're explaining how that evidence supports your argument. You can't just throw in a random, oh, well, this was like when this other thing happened. If it's not a support of your topic sentence, it won't count as outside evidence. And again, write EBD, evidence beyond the document, so that the reader kind of sees, oh, you're right, that pastoralism or the Yuan dynasty was not used. In the other paragraph, I might have brought in, the Trung sisters we mentioned, how they in that region, that if you didn't use it for context, you could use it for outside evidence, how in Southeast Asia and Vietnam they had a little bit more power. The word or the term matrilineal, I don't think is used, but you could use that for Mali. Talk about Southeast Asia, women were more important in trade. Context might have been, monsoon mariners, Indian Ocean traders. You could talk about the Strait of Malacca being close to Southeast Asia and why that was so significant and important to trade with China. You could talk about the Chinese hegemony. They're sending diplomats and traders to Southeast Asia. They're sending their diplomats to exact tribute and get favorable advantages in trade and that kind of thing. Context or contextualization. This one was tricky, guys. I'm not going to lie to you. This one was a little bit tricky because you've got all of these different regions throughout the world, and you're trying to think of a broad global process that unites all of these. So a lot of you attempted trade to try to bring in all these societies together. The thing about trade was, if you discuss Silk Road, et cetera, and how that, led to exchange of ideas and influenced women's perspective. Well, Silk Road doesn't really affect women in Mali. It doesn't really affect women in Cambodia. If you talked about the trans-Saharan trade, that doesn't really impact women in China. So it's such a broad, swath of Afro-Eurasia, basically every single region except Europe in Afro-Eurasia that is discussed in these documents. So what is it we could use besides trade? We can't really use political states because that's not an umbrella, a broad umbrella that all of them fit into. Some of you guys attempted the Pax Mongolica and, how women, their influence, the Mongols' influence impacted women throughout Afro-Eurasia, but they don't really reach West Africa. It doesn't really impact women there. So what else? What other themes can we use here? So the question that I would ask is, well, what is it that led some of these societies to be more restrictive on women, and why did some of these societies, why did women have a little bit more freedom? And if you look at which societies women did seem to have more freedoms and which societies women were more restricted, you can kind of look along the lines or through the lens of religion, right? And we started to see that with the Ibn Battuta document and how he was shocked and how he was dismayed about all of these liberties and freedoms and immodest actions of these Malian women, right? Because he is closer to, in North Africa, he is closer to the Abbasid Caliphate. He's closer to the core of Islam. In sub-Saharan Africa, they're a little bit further away, right? And so they may not have some of these same, these same mores and same expectations for women. Similarly, if you look over in China, in East Asia, women are much more restricted. And why is that? Confucianism, of course, right? So instead of trade and politics here, if I were writing a contextualization, I would write something about how religion had a great impact on women's ability to exercise influence and hold power, right? Now, you could bring in Islam, you could bring in Confucianism, you could bring in how women had more freedoms because of Buddhism. Right, Buddhism was taught when everyone's a little bit more equal, and there's this less of a Judeo, Arabic, Christian, Islamic view of the man is the most important part of the family. Buddhism, not so much, right? And so maybe in Buddhist cultures and Buddhist societies in Central Asia, Southeast Asia, women had more egalitarian experiences versus the Judeo-Christian, which really Judaism and Christianity isn't really addressed in these documents, but Islamic civilizations and Confucian, which were, a little bit more repressive in terms of how women were treated in their societies. They had a place they had to know their place in these societies, right? And so that's kind of what I would do. I would use religion in this instance because I think that's something that's broad enough that you can bring in, and it impacts all of these different societies and regions. And then, of course, once you have your topic sentences here, the thesis kind of writes itself. I sat down and I wrote a sample essay to this set of documents, which I'm going to link on the lesson plan for this week, so you can kind of check it out on Google Classroom. Clearly, I, have the leisure of time, and I was able to go through this with you guys and do this plan chart again. You're not going to have that much leisure time to do all of this process. But again, as long as you're going through these documents, you're thinking about the gist. How can I use these documents to answer the prompt? What are some things I could use to start typing out my context? What are a couple of different pieces of outside evidence I could use as supporting arguments? And once you have your topic sentences, that lends itself right into your thesis. Okay, so I hope this was helpful. And again, like I said, I'll upload or link the sample exemplar DBQ essay, the 3-paragraph essay that I wrote, and you can kind of compare it. Let me know if you guys have any questions.